Hi, how's it going? Longtime viewers of the channel may recall, and I realize this is improbable, but some time ago, on a relatively early Goodwill outlet run, I picked up this Busby Tactical Storm. I never really used it much because I have so many Busby blasters, but recently I tried to use it, and I found that it was actually non-functional, which explains why it was given to Goodwill. And what I found is as follows. So, as a quick backstory, Busby has a long lineage of mag-fed top prime springers, and you have the Champion. I think this is the first one. I'm not sure about that. You have the Reaper, Tactical Storm, Night Attack. There's quite a few of them at this point. And the way they work, in part, is when you pull the trigger, there is a dart tooth. I'm not sure how well this will show up, but I'm going to pull the trigger, and the dart tooth will kind of lay flat like that. So as I pull the trigger, there's a linkage in the blaster that makes that dart tooth go down. Now, as a consequence of that, if you are so inclined, you could actually front load it. So again, not sure how well this will show up, but you can't front load it just normally. But if you pull the trigger, you can push in a dart and then prime it and fire it. So that's in one that works. That's a little bit easier to do in the Reaper, I would say, than the Champion. This is a little bit deeper, you have to press it. And the Tactical Storm has, as far as I know, the same internals, but somehow this person who owned it before me, their dart tooth appears to have come uncoupled from the linkage to the trigger. So when you press the trigger, nothing happens. That little tooth is not moving at all. And more importantly, when you go to fire the blaster, the tooth is totally non-functional. So you need that to work in order for the Busby blaster to function as you'd expect. So I thought I would make a video where I try to repair this non-functional Tactical Storm. So here we are. First, I'm going to do a quick disassembly, and I'll probably skip ahead. Now, also related to Busby blasters, almost all of them, or at least a whole lot of them, have this front cap glued or solvent welded on, and it's very difficult to remove. I've seen a technique where you can dip it in boiling water to try and essentially remelt the adhesive. I'm not sure I'm really up to that on at least one of my other blasters. On my Snipe, I just kind of cut right through it. I forget if I Dremeled or hacksawed it. But I'll probably just cut this one because I think the main reason when you want this intact is if you want to use an extended barrel on it, and I don't really care about having an extended barrel basically ever. So probably just cut that. One of the nice things about disassembling Busby blasters is that normally all of the screws are the same size. On a number of Busby blasters, the springers, normally you're going to have to remove the top prime first because it kind of grabs around the shell. And similarly, some of the grips have something which you also have to remove first. So I've done that here. I expect that apart from this front, all of the rest of the shell will just be removing the screws, and then it'll come apart. On my Reaper that I modded, I actually was able to get a flathead screwdriver underneath the cap and just kind of pry it off. I don't think that's going to be nearly as possible here because you have such a small margin of where you can insert it. Yeah, that's not going to happen, I don't think. So, I'm just going to Dremel right through the thing. Put on those safety glasses. didn't quite get all the way with the Dremel, mostly because I wanted to not cut where I shouldn't. With a rotary, the circle, you can only reach so much of it, but I was able to crack the rest of it. Alright, so everything functional about the blaster is on one side. So essentially what we have going on with the part that's not working, this is that dart tooth I was talking about. It sits on this rod, pivots on it, and then this linkage here from the trigger, let me just take this out. This linkage from the trigger, it's a small thin wire, and this part moves, so I will have to refigure out how that works, but it shouldn't be too hard. This is the torsion spring responsible for bringing up the tooth to the vertical position when it's released. Now while we're in here, we could do some modding things such as, but not limited to, stronger spring. We could probably do a brass breech or something like that if we wanted, and maybe I will down the line, but I think for now I'm just going to settle for fixing this so it works. Interestingly, the lock mechanism is different from what I remember. I want to say that like when I've been in a Reaper, at the very least when I've been in a Snipe, the lock block is totally different. So this large black piece here is going to be the lock, and probably you could take that out if you wanted to be able to deprime the blaster or something like that. Alright, so I failed to work it out on my own, how to do this, and I ended up taking apart my previously modded Reaper. Here's a quick look at that if you're curious. Mostly I removed this bar and I made it able to take Nerf drums, but that's another story. Anyway, I took this apart to remind myself how the torsion spring goes. Alright, now I don't know if I'm going to be able to do a very good job of explaining and or showing this, but here goes. On the dart tooth, which is identical between these two by the way, on the dart tooth there's a little tiny tab here. When the tooth is in the blaster, the tab is on this side of the shell, not the top that has no internals. So there's a little tab here, and then the torsion spring has two, I don't know, hooks or teeth. One of those hooks, this is not going to show up well, one of the hooks is in line to be able to, when you slide it over the edge of the tooth, it goes right over the tab. Now, assembling this with this in place and trying to kind of drop it in there just right is extremely difficult. So when I reassembled the Reaper, I actually used the tiniest drop of super glue, and I'm going to do that here again. And that's really just to hold the tooth, theoretically at least, that's really just to hold this tooth from the spring onto this peg or tooth of the tooth. Teeniest drop of super glue, because you don't want to glue it such that the spring won't do its thing. You essentially just want the spring to be held to the dart tooth enough that it doesn't fall off when you're trying to reinsert the thing. Now also getting the spring fully onto the dart tooth can be tricky. I actually have been using a flathead screwdriver because there is some friction there. So I'm just pushing that down enough. Alright, this is the tricky part. I put this rod in the blaster in advance. I have given consideration to supergluing the rod into the blaster. That might actually be better to make this operation easier, but I haven't fully committed to that idea yet. Anyway, all you really need to do, haha, he said jokingly, you want to have the dart tooth rotated forward. You're inserting this onto the rod, and that other tooth that's on the spring, you want to be below this protrusion in the plastic. So you make sure it's below, and then as you're inserting the tooth, you rotate it and slide the tooth down. And also, this trigger needs to be back. So you're coordinating multiple things at a time. I want to try and get a finger in there to hold the torsion spring in place. But ultimately, here's what you end up with. The little tab or tooth on the spring is below this part of the shell. So when I pull the trigger, it drops down, and then when I release the trigger, it pops back up. That's really all you need to do. That tooth needs to be articulated in that way. Now the trick here is actually going to be reinserting the plunger tube while not losing the dark tooth, but hopefully I can... Alright, that wasn't too bad actually. After making sure everything is seated correctly and that the shell will close, I will close the shell. I had also taken out the mag release just in case it was going to spring out and fly everywhere while I was doing this, but obviously you want your mag release back in the blaster as well. It looks like the plunger tube is sliding correctly, so I'm going to close it up. Now the main thing here is before I put all the screws in and reassemble everything, I just want to make sure that my dark tooth is still articulating as it should. And it is. So that's good. Alright, so the Tactical Storm is reassembled. Just going to load some Nerf darts into a magazine. And everything works great. That's awesome. So, in the future, I may take this blaster and maybe upgrade the spring, do something with a tighter breech to make it shoot harder, but Busby blasters already shoot decently for stock, at least. Hopefully you've enjoyed this, and I really hope that I was able to explain well enough how to repair this particular problem. The main takeaway is essentially there's only one way that the torsion spring can go in there properly. I hope you enjoyed this, and see you next time.